Nowadays, you might be forgiven for not knowing much about the Ivory Coast, since the last time they qualified to a World Cup was almost 10 years ago. However, this national team once possessed the greatest African golden generation, with a majority of the squad competing for the most important competitions in club football. And perhaps even more impressive, they united a divided country and their star power was enough to stop a war. So why were they forgotten? How can a team like Drogba, Gervinho, the Touré brothers and many others fall into obscurity? Well, stick around until the end of the video because I'm sure the answer will surprise you, but first, let me give you some context. Before 2006, the Ivorians had only won one African Cup of Nations, but they did it in the most dramatic but boring way possible, beating Ghana after 24 penalties in one of the longest shootouts in football history. After that, not much happened in the grandest stage. They failed to debut in the World Cup and they didn't win another African Cup of Nations. But while the world was sleeping on the Ivorians, there was a golden generation being forged in fire. In 1999, the entire Azek Mimosa squad was getting older. Many of the players who had won the African Champions League in the previous year had already left, or at least wanted to. So in a shock move, the directors decided to replace the entire squad with youth players for the upcoming Super Cup. Their opponents were furious. Esperance took it as a huge disrespect and called it a scandal to be playing against children. But you see, those children weren't just children. They were the rising stars that would one day make an entire continent dream. Kolo Touré, Didier Zokora, Aruna Dindan and many other kids were strong enough to beat Esperance 3-1 and conquer their first piece of silverware. And in the following years, many other talents would rise from Azek, Yaya Touré, Emmanuel Eboué, Gervinho, just to name a few. All of those youngsters were the backbone of the squad, and their firing power would come soon after. By 2002, Drogba had finally reached Liga after years of climbing through the ranks in France, doing so while he was also studying and being a father. At this point, the lines were drawn, and one of the most solid African teams had begun their quest for domination. But luck wasn't on their side. Their last two African Cup of Nations ended with group stage exits, and in the 2004 edition, the Ivorians didn't even qualify. Perhaps it was lack of experience, perhaps it was tough draws. Either way, with results like that, they couldn't expect to receive a favorable draw to qualify for the World Cup. So it came as no surprise when the Ivory Coast was placed in a group of death containing Egypt and Cameroon, with only a single team advancing to the World Cup. At first sight, it looked like the golden generation might not even make it to the World Cup, as the direct rivals, despite looking inferior individually, certainly had achieved more as a nation than the Elephants. But against all odds, the Ivorians prevailed and edged past Cameroon following a win against Sudan. That match will not only go down in history as the moment where the Ivorians qualified for their first World Cup, but also the day where Drogba ended a 5-year-long civil war with a passionate speech to the combatants. So here came the 2006 World Cup draw, and there was no way the Ivorians would get another group of death, right? Well, Egypt and Cameroon start to look much easier when you compare them to their World Cup fortune. Serbia and Montenegro, the Netherlands and Argentina, the toughest group in their World Cup debut. The expectations were lowered immediately, but there was still hope that we could see a surprise. I mean, the Edges finished runners-up in the AFCON. But the Netherlands also had their own golden generation on the rise, and Argentina, well, they were Argentina. Plus, they had young Messi in their squad. They were eliminated after 2 matches, but a comeback win against Serbia and Montenegro was enough to raise the nation's spirits, and it gave the impression that without the death group, the Ivory Coast would achieve much more. Fast forward 4 years and we're on to the next World Cup. The Ivory Coast was no longer a team of young promising stars. They were an established squad with pretty much everyone on their prime. They had one of the best strikers in the world in Didier Drogba and his Chelsea partner Salomon Kalou. The Touré brothers would soon be playing together at the Etihad, the explosion of Gervinho and the composure of the late Sheikh Tiote and Didier Zokora. They were no longer the underdogs, and that pressure felt like it was weighing on them. Everyone was a star at club level, and at times, the overconfidence they exhibited in their matches played against them, as in both 2008 and 2010, the Ivory Coast came crashing out of the AFCON despite being the clear favourites. But now, in a World Cup played in Africa, it was time for the redemption. All the stars aligned for them, except for one, the draw. It's always a draw, isn't it? This time, they were faced with North Korea, 5-time world champions Brazil, and Cristiano's Portugal. A win against North Korea and a draw against Portugal wouldn't be enough to qualify them to the next round, and once again, the Ivorians failed when it mattered the most. At this point, it felt like a curse. They would either play with overconfidence against weaker nations, or they would have incredibly tougher groups. And even when everything was perfect, they still couldn't win. There's not a better example to this than the 2012 AFCON. The Ivorians had an easy route to the final, they gave no chance to their opponents, but when they met an average Zambia side, they couldn't put them away and lost on penalties. 1 year later, they got eliminated by a rising Nigerian squad, and from that moment on, nobody expected the Ivorian golden generation to win anything anymore. Although they had qualified to the 2014 World Cup, they were all past their prime. The stars that were once killing in the best clubs in the world were now mostly on weaker sides or warming up the bench, and worst of all, there wasn't another golden generation on the rise. But this time, luck was actually on their side. The Ivory Coast got drawn into a very balanced group containing Colombia, who were going to this tournament without their biggest star, Greece, and Japan. A win against Japan gave hope of an early qualification, but a loss against Colombia in the next match put the pressure once again on their shoulders for their final match against Greece. However, luck was once again on their side, and due to Colombia's win against Japan, the Ivory Coast only needed to hold their 1-1 result until the end. They only needed to overcome the pressure, and they were into the next round to face Costa Rica. I mean, after all, they could make history and at least in... Nope. They conceded a penalty in the 93rd minute and were sent home, finishing 3rd in the group stage for the 3rd time in a row. And just like that, the dream was over. Except that it wasn't, and 1 year later, without their greatest player ever, the Ivory Coast would win the most cursed AFCON of all time. A tournament haunted by the Ebola epidemic and that a total of 4 countries refused to host. The Ivorians were no longer the favorites, and despite having a tough route to the final, they overcame every nation, winning the competition 23 years later on another long-ass penalty shootout, and also against Ghana. I could wrap this video up and say that the reason why they always failed to deliver was because of a curse, and you couldn't blame me. After all, witchcraft is pretty common in Africa, and their trajectory is extremely odd. But in all seriousness, it's pretty evident that the main reason behind their failures was the massive pressure that they had on their shoulders. They all knew how good they were. For almost a decade, these players spent 9 months of their year fighting for supremacy in club football. They were Champions League winners, treble winners. When you're so clearly above everyone else, the matches are yours to lose, and that feeling can really mess with a man's mind. And when you don't have a Jose Mourinho or a Pep Guardiola to keep your feet on the ground, it's ridiculous to expect more than just stars running around the field trying to win the game for themselves. And that is it for the video. I hope you enjoyed the ride. If you did, make sure you leave a like so I know you want to watch more content like this, and subscribe so you never miss the most interesting football discussions, stories, and news. Leave a comment if you want to see me make a video on a specific topic, and as always, thank you for watching until the end. I appreciate you, and I will see you soon.